The air was thick and heavy, a humid blanket that clung to the skin and carried the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. It was late September of 1851, and the woods surrounding the town of Mill Creek, Alabama, were a vibrant, if oppressive, tapestry of greens and browns. Sheriff Thomas Finch wiped a bead of sweat from his brow, his gaze fixed on the dense tree line that marked the edge of the known world for many of the town's folk. His weathered face, a map of sun-creased lines, showed a practiced weariness. He'd seen plenty of trouble in his 40-odd years, but never anything quite like this. A search party had been organized at dawn, a collection of tired, worried men from Mill Creek and the surrounding farms. 3 men, Elias Thorne, his son Silas, and their neighbor Jeremiah Croft, had gone hunting 2 days prior and hadn't returned. They were experienced woodsmen, not the type to get lost, which only amplified the growing dread. Elias was a respected cotton farmer, a man of quiet faith and unwavering routine. Silas, a young man of 22, was known for his steady hand and keen eye. Jeremiah, a widower who kept to himself, was perhaps the most skilled hunter in the county. Their collective disappearance was a puzzle with no clear pieces. Thomas listened to the murmurs of the men around him. "Said they were heading for Blackwood," one man muttered, his voice low and concerned. "Good deer hunting there, but the ground's treacherous, easy to get turned around." "They'd never get turned around," another replied, shaking his head. "Not those 3. Something else is amiss." The general unease was palpable. The woods, while familiar, held a certain reputation. Stories whispered around bonfires and hushed in parlors spoke of strange occurrences, of travelers getting disoriented, of lights flickering where no lamps should be. Thomas dismissed most of it as superstition, the kind of fanciful tales born from loneliness and too much corn liquor. His reality was grounded in the tangible: mud-caked boots, the weight of his sidearm, the cold dread of a search for bodies, not ghosts. As they moved deeper into the woods, the world shrank. The canopy of leaves blocked out the sun, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. The only sounds were the crunch of their boots on the leaf litter, the snap of a twig, and the distant cry of a hawk. Thomas was a man of action and logic, and he used his senses to guide him. He looked for broken branches, scuffed earth, anything that would indicate a path. They found the hunting camp late in the afternoon, near a winding creek that fed into the Blackwood. It was a perfectly ordinary sight: a small, smoldering fire pit, a canvas tent neatly pitched, and a few provisions left untouched. The absence of the men was jarring. A half-eaten loaf of bread sat on a log, and 2 rifles were propped against a tree, their barrels glinting in the dim light. It was as if they had simply vanished mid-meal. Thomas knelt by the fire pit, running his fingers through the cool ash. The fire had been out for a while, perhaps since the previous night. The men hadn't just left. They had been here, preparing for a long stay. So what could have pulled them away so suddenly? He looked at the untouched rifles. No hunter would leave their weapon behind, especially not 3 of them. This wasn't a simple case of getting lost. This was something far stranger. He called the search party closer. "Look around," he instructed, his voice firm. "Look for signs. Anything." The men fanned out, their voices hushed, their movements cautious. The quiet efficiency of the search party was broken by a sudden shout. "Sheriff Finch, over here." Thomas moved quickly, his boots sinking into the damp ground as he followed the sound. He found old Mr. Abernathy, a man with more years than teeth, staring at something on the ground. It was a footprint deep in the mud. A man's boot, but something about it was off. The print was elongated, the heel dragging. It looked like someone had been stumbling, dragging their feet. "That ain't Silas's boot," Abernathy said, his voice trembling slightly. "It's too big, and look at the way it's misshapen." Thomas knelt down, his fingers tracing the outline. The print was indeed strange, almost as if the person had a joint deformity. But more than that, there was a series of them, leading away from the camp and deeper into the swamp. He followed the trail, his mind turning over possibilities. Was one of the men injured? Had they encountered a stranger? The trail led them into a patch of gnarled, twisted cypress trees, their roots snaking through the water like skeletal fingers. The air here was even heavier, and the scent of decay was overpowering. The sun was setting now, casting long, menacing shadows. Thomas felt a prickle of unease on the back of his neck, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his days as a soldier in the Mexican-American War. This wasn't just a lost party anymore. This was a mystery that felt alive, breathing and watching. He raised a hand, stopping the men behind him. "We're not going any deeper in the dark," he announced, his voice carrying an authority born of experience. "We'll set up camp here and continue at first light." The men grumbled, but obeyed. They had been searching for hours, and the thought of a long night in the suffocating woods was a comfortless one. As they set up a new camp, a young man named Jesse, who had a reputation for being a bit of a gossip, pointed to a small, dark figure standing on a distant rise. It was too far away to make out any details, but its posture was unnervingly still, almost unnatural. "Sheriff?" Jesse whispered, his eyes wide. "Is that someone?" "They've been there for a while, just watching." Thomas squinted, his hand going to the pistol at his hip. The figure remained motionless, a dark silhouette against the fading light. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, melting into the shadows of the forest. Thomas told himself it was just a hunter, a local who didn't want to be disturbed, but a chilling doubt lingered. Why would someone just stand there and watch them and then disappear? The mystery was thickening, twisting like the roots of the cypress trees around them. 3 men gone, a strange footprint, and a silent figure watching from a distance. The only comfort was the flickering fire they'd managed to start, a small defiance against the encroaching darkness. As Thomas laid his head down for the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was an actor in a play he didn't understand, and the stage had just been set. The Blackwood Swamp was holding its secrets close, and he had a feeling it wouldn't give them up easily. The following morning was cold and damp, the ground slick with a fresh mist. Thomas Finch rose before the sun, the lingering chill in the air doing little to calm the unease that had settled in his stomach. He roused the men, their faces grim and weary. The silence of the night had been broken only by the hoot of an owl and the rustling of unseen creatures in the undergrowth, each sound amplifying the feeling of being watched. They resumed the search at first light, following the faint trail of the strange footprints. The path led them deeper into the heart of Blackwood Swamp, where the cypress trees grew in a tighter, more suffocating cluster. The mud was thick here, a sucking bog that threatened to swallow a man whole. Thomas felt his resolve hardening. This wasn't a game. It was a desperate search for answers. Suddenly a shout echoed through the trees, not from his party, but from a different direction. It was a familiar voice, high-pitched and panicked. The voice of young Peter, a farmhand from the Thorne family, who had been tasked with checking the western perimeter of the swamp. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest as he and the men ran toward the sound, their boots squelching in the mire. They found him on the edge of the swamp, near an old, rotting log. He was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. "Sheriff, I found them," he stammered, pointing a trembling finger into a small clearing. Thomas pushed past him, his gaze sweeping the scene. There, huddled against a gnarled oak tree, were Elias Thorne, Silas Thorne, and Jeremiah Croft. They were alive, but something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. They were no longer the men who had left Mill Creek. Elias, a man of 55, looked like he had crossed a century. His hair was a shock of pure white, his face a web of deep, cavernous wrinkles. His skin was sallow, stretched tight over his bones. Silas, the 22-year-old with the strong jaw and bright eyes, now had a stooped posture and a wispy gray beard. His hands were gnarled, and his movements were slow and unsteady, as if every joint ached. Jeremiah, the reclusive hunter, was the worst of them. His body was gaunt, his eyes sunken and unfocused, and his hands trembled uncontrollably. The men in the search party gasped. A few clutched their Bibles, muttering prayers. "Thomas," A man of science and logic felt his reality begin to fray. He knelt before Elias, his voice soft. "Elias, what happened? Are you hurt?" Elias looked at him, his eyes cloudy and distant. He tried to speak, but only a dry, rattling cough escaped his lips. His mouth worked, forming words that never came out. He looked at his son, then at Jeremiah, and a single tear, heavy with unspeakable sorrow, rolled down his cheek. Silas finally spoke, his voice a raspy whisper. We were just hunting. The light, it wasn't right." His words were fragmented, a jumble of half-finished thoughts. The swamp, it was loud. Thomas tried to get a straight answer, but it was like trying to hold smoke. The men's memories were fragmented, their minds as aged as their bodies. They spoke of a loud silence, a wrong light, and a shepherd of shadows. The words were nonsensical, born of a reality Thomas couldn't comprehend. Back in Mill Creek, the return of the hunting party sparked an immediate and frantic hysteria. The town doctor, a young man named Dr. Alistair Finch, Thomas's nephew, examined the men and could offer no medical explanation. Their vital signs were stable, but their physical and mental deterioration was complete. It wasn't a disease or an injury. It was as if time had been stolen from them, a physical manifestation of a psychological trauma. Thomas found himself at the center of a storm. The townspeople, who had once trusted his calm authority, now looked at him with a mix of fear and expectation. They wanted answers, and they were beginning to look for explanations beyond the logical. Whispers of a curse, of a vengeful spirit, or of a deal with the devil spread like wildfire. A small mob gathered outside the Thorn house, where the men were recuperating, demanding to know what evil had befallen them. Thomas stood on the porch, his shotgun in hand, facing the crowd. "There's no curse here," he said, his voice firm and steady. "These men are sick, and we need to find out what happened to them. We need to stay calm and use our heads, not give in to fear." The crowd quieted, but the mistrust remained. They saw the evidence with their own eyes. 3 men who had entered the swamp as able-bodied hunters and returned as withered husks. Later that evening, Thomas visited Dr. Alistair at his small office. Alistair looked exhausted, a stack of medical journals on his desk, his face buried in his hands. "Uncle Thomas," he said, his voice raw with frustration, "I've read everything I can. There's nothing like this in any medical text. There's cellular degradation. It's as if their bodies were subjected to an accelerated aging process. But there's no known cause for such a thing." "I know," Thomas said, running a hand through his hair. "But I've got to find an answer. The people, they're ready to blame the swamp, to blame anything that fits their fears." Alistair looked at his uncle, his expression a mix of concern and resolve. "There's something else. Silas." He had a few moments of clarity. He kept talking about a man who was watching them. He called him the Shepherd. The name sent a shiver down Thomas's spine. It brought back the memory of the dark figure he had seen on the ridge the previous night. "Did he say anything else?" Alistair shook his head. "Just that the Shepherd told them to embrace the quiet. I don't know what it means, but it's all he could say before he drifted off again." Thomas returned to his office, his mind racing. A man named the Shepherd. What did it mean? He opened a local map of Mill Creek and the surrounding forests, his finger tracing the path of the Blackwood Swamp. The more he looked at it, the more he felt like he was missing something. The swamp wasn't just a physical place, it felt like a character in this twisted drama, a silent witness to a horror he couldn't yet name. He thought about the untouched rifles, the half-eaten bread, and the strange, stumbling footprints. It all pointed to a sudden, immediate event. Something or someone had caused them to flee, leaving everything behind. And that something was linked to the Shepherd. He knew he couldn't fight the town's growing panic with facts alone. He needed to find the man who had done this, to bring him to justice before the fear consumed them all. He grabbed his hat, his face set in a grim determination. The swamp had yielded its victims, and now it was time for it to yield its secrets. The days that followed were a blur of questions and dead ends. Thomas Finch spent his time interviewing anyone who had seen the hunting party before they vanished. The accounts were all the same: 3 men in good spirits heading to Blackwood Swamp for a few days of hunting. There were no arguments, no strange encounters, and no signs of trouble. The town of Mill Creek, once a quiet, predictable place, now felt charged with a volatile energy. Every shadow seemed to hold a secret, and every conversation was laced with fear. The town's general store owner, a woman named Martha, was the first to offer a potential clue. Thomas had been speaking with her, trying to find a pattern in the small details. She was known for her sharp memory and even sharper wit. "You know, Sheriff," she said, wiping down her counter. "A man came in a few days before they left. I'd never seen him before, didn't buy much, just some tobacco and a few candles." "What did he look like?" Thomas asked, his pen poised over his notebook. "Hard to say," she replied, her brow furrowed in thought. "He kept to himself, but he had a presence. Quiet, but you knew he was there. And his eyes, they were a strange shade of blue, almost like ice." "Did he say anything to you?" "Just asked for the items, and he seemed to know his way around. Asked about the hunting parties that frequented the swamp. Said he was a naturalist of some sort, looking for rare plants and animals." She paused, her eyes meeting his. "But I had a bad feeling about him, Sheriff. Just a gut feeling. Said his name was Elias." Thomas's hand froze. Elias. The same name as one of the victims. But the man in the store couldn't have been the same person. The description was all wrong. And Elias Thorne had lived in Mill Creek his entire life. He wrote it down anyway, a small detail in a sea of questions. He left the store and made his way to the Thorne homestead. The house, once filled with the warmth of a bustling family, now felt like a mausoleum. He found Elias's wife, Sarah, sitting by the fire, her hands clutched in her lap. She was a strong woman, but the last few days had broken her. Her eyes were red-rimmed and she hadn't slept. "Sarah, I need to ask you something," Thomas said gently, sitting opposite her. "Did Elias ever mention anyone he was going to meet in the woods? Anyone at all?" She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "No, just the usual trip. They had a spot, you know, a place they've been going for years. He was just going with Silas and Jeremiah. Nothing out of the ordinary. He stayed for a while, offering what little comfort he could. He spoke with Silas, whose mind was a tangled mess of confusion. The young man would have moments of lucidity, but they were brief and fleeting. He kept repeating the same phrases like a broken record. He told us to listen to the quiet. The shepherd. He knows the way." Thomas felt a wave of frustration wash over him. He was a man who dealt in facts, in evidence. This was all whispers and half-truths. He needed something tangible. He needed to find a physical link, a reason. He decided to return to the scene of the incident. The townspeople were now calling it the cursed ground, and no one would go near it. He went alone, a silent sentinel in the oppressive quiet of the woods. The air was different now. The scent of decay was stronger, and a profound stillness hung in the air. The old hunting camp was exactly as they had left it, the fire pit cold, the tent sagging in the damp. He walked to the spot where the men had been found. There was no sign of a struggle, no footprints other than those of the search party. It was as if they had simply materialized there. He knelt, his eyes scanning the ground. The strange footprints from the search day were gone, washed away by a light rain. But something else caught his eye. Just at the edge of the clearing, partially covered by a rotting log, was a small, circular device made of brass. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was about the size of a pocket watch, but with a small, intricate dial on the front. He picked it up, feeling its surprising weight. It was cold to the touch. The dial had no numbers, but instead strange symbols etched into the surface. He turned it over in his hand, a flicker of hope igniting in his chest. This was it, a piece of evidence, a clue that wasn't a whisper or a fleeting memory. This was a physical link to what had happened. It was a piece of technology far more advanced than anything he knew. He pocketed the device and continued to search the area. He followed the trail that had led them to the men, the one that had been lost. He found nothing else of note, but as he turned to leave, a sense of being watched returned. He spun around, his hand on his sidearm, but there was nothing there. Only the trees, silent and menacing. He felt a deep-seated chill. The presence was back. The shepherd was still here, somewhere. He walked back to town, the brass device heavy in his pocket. He decided to show it to his nephew, Alistair. He knew the young doctor had a keen mind and an interest in new inventions. Maybe he could shed some light on what this strange object was. As he walked, he reflected on the new information. The strange man in the store, the name Elias, the bizarre device. It all pointed to a rational, if highly unusual explanation. This wasn't a curse. This was a man with a motive and the means to do something incomprehensible. The fear of the supernatural began to recede, replaced by a more chilling and more realistic kind of terror. The terror of what one human being was capable of doing to another. He felt a newfound determination. He would find the shepherd, and he would uncover the truth, no matter how macabre it turned out to be. Dr. Alistair Finch's office was a sanctuary of order and reason in a town descending into chaos. When Thomas showed him the brass device, the young doctor's eyes lit up with a mixture of scientific curiosity and sheer bewilderment. He took it carefully, turning it over in his hands, his fingers tracing the strange symbols on the dial. "Uncle Thomas, this is extraordinary," Alistair said, his voice hushed. "The craftsmanship alone is far beyond anything made in this region. Look at the precision of the gears. And these symbols, they're not a known language. They look like some kind of schematic, but for what?" Thomas watched him, his hope growing. "Any idea what it is, what it does?" Alistair shook his head, placing the device on his desk. "I'm not sure, but I can tell you what it's not. It's not a clock. It's not a compass, and it's not a musical box. It's too complex, too intricate. The energy source, there's a small compartment here for something. A small battery, perhaps. Something to power the mechanism." "A battery?" Thomas frowned. "I've heard of such things, but they're not common. Certainly not in these parts." "Exactly," Alistair said, leaning back in his chair. "This is a custom-made device. It suggests that whoever made it is far more advanced than anyone we know. This isn't just a man. It's a man of science. A man who understands things we don't." Thomas's mind went back to Silas's fractured words. The shepherd, he knows the way. A man of science, a man who understood a way they didn't. The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a horrifying picture. "I need to know what this device does," Thomas said. "Could it have been used on them?" Alistair looked at the device, then back at his uncle, a deep concern etched on his face. "It's possible. It could be some sort of a catalyst. A device that, when activated, could cause a rapid physical change. But for what purpose? Why would someone do this?" "Power," Thomas said, a cold certainty in his voice. "Control. The man, the shepherd, he wants to prove he has control. Control over time, over a man's life." Alistair's eyes widened. "It's a terrifying thought, Uncle. A man who can steal time." The two men spent the rest of the evening poring over the device, but they could make no sense of its function. They could only speculate. Thomas knew he couldn't wait for a scientific breakthrough. He had to find the man who had created it. He had to find the shepherd. The next day, Thomas revisited the general store, this time with a more specific set of questions for Martha. "The man you saw," he said. "Did he buy anything else? Anything that might seem out of place for a naturalist?" Martha thought for a moment, her gaze fixed on the ceiling. "Come to think of it, he did. He bought a large amount of a very specific type of sulfur. The kind used in old-fashioned black powder, but he wanted a large quantity. Said he was going to use it for an experiment." Thomas's mind raced. Sulfur, a key component in many chemical reactions. But what kind of experiment? And why would he need so much? He left the store with a new lead and a renewed sense of urgency. The pieces were still scattered, but they were beginning to form a shape. The shepherd wasn't just a madman. He was a methodical, calculating scientist. He was experimenting on human beings, using them as guinea pigs for some dark purpose. Thomas went to see Silas again, armed with the new information. He found the young man in a state of deep despondency, staring blankly out the window. His wife, a beautiful young woman named Clara, sat beside him, her hand in his. Her face was a mask of grief and confusion. "Silas," Thomas said gently, "do you remember the man, the shepherd? What did he do? Did he give you anything?" Silas's eyes, clouded with age and trauma, flickered. He gave us a drink," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "A bitter drink. He said it would make us see the quiet." Clara gasped, tears streaming down her face. "He told me he had a terrible thirst," she whispered. "That he drank a whole flask of water when he returned, but it didn't help." Thomas felt a cold dread settle in his bones. A drink, a bitter concoction given to them before the incident. This wasn't a simple disappearance. This was a premeditated act, a cruel experiment. The device, the sulfur, the strange drink. It all pointed to a single horrific conclusion. The men hadn't just aged, they had been poisoned. Their bodies had been subjected to a chemical cocktail that had accelerated their aging process. He thanked Clara and left, his mind consumed by a righteous fury. He had a motive now. The shepherd wasn't a ghostly figure, he was a scientist, a man playing God in the quiet, secluded forests of Alabama. Thomas knew he had to find him, and he had to do it before anyone else became a victim. The town was on a knife's edge, and one more tremor of fear could send it toppling into madness. He would find the shepherd, and he would make him pay for the horrors he had unleashed. The new lead was a long shot, but it was all Thomas had. He spent the next few days scouring the county for any trace of a man fitting the description Martha had given him. He spoke to farmers, trappers, and itinerant merchants, showing them a crude sketch of the man's face, a face he had pieced together from Martha's and Silas's disjointed descriptions. The ice-blue eyes, the thin, precise features, the quiet demeanor. The break came from an old trapper named Jedediah, a man who lived a solitary existence deep in the woods. Jedediah was a man of few words, but his knowledge of the backwoods was unparalleled. Thomas found him at his cabin, a small, ramshackle dwelling surrounded by animal traps and drying pelts. "I saw him," Jedediah said, his voice a low rumble. "A few weeks ago. He was setting up camp a little ways north of the Blackwood Swamp. Had a strange sort of contraption with him. A tent made of thick canvas and a lot of glass bottles." Thomas felt a jolt of adrenaline. "A contraption? What kind?" "Like some kind of a laboratory," Jedediah grunted. "Pipes and tubes and strange bottles. Said he was a botanist, but no botanist I ever met smelled like that. Had a real chemical stench about him. Smelled like a blacksmith's shop on a hot day." "Did he mention his name?" Thomas asked, his heart pounding. "Just called himself the shepherd," Jedediah said, his eyes narrowing. "Said he was guiding nature to its true potential. Gave me the creeps. So I left him alone." Thomas thanked him and left, his mind racing. A laboratory in the woods. A man who called himself the shepherd. It all fit. The sulfur, the strange device, the bitter drink. The man was a chemist, and he was conducting his horrific experiments in the solitude of the forest. He was a scientist, a man who had strayed from the path of reason and become a monster. He returned to town and gathered a small group of trustworthy men, his nephew Alistair, the town constable Marcus, and two of the more level-headed farmers. He explained the situation, and to his relief, they believed him. The evidence was too overwhelming to be dismissed as superstition. The men were quiet, their faces grim, but they were with him. They would not let this madman get away. They armed themselves and headed back to the Blackwood Swamp, following Jedediah's directions. The journey was long and arduous, the terrain unforgiving. The sun was beginning to set by the time they reached the clearing. The air was different here, heavy with the metallic tang of chemicals. They saw it before they saw the man. A large, elaborate canvas tent, a small, makeshift laboratory. They approached cautiously, their guns raised. There was no one there. The laboratory was in a state of disarray, as if the owner had left in a hurry. Beakers and vials were scattered across a makeshift table, some of them still containing a dark, oily liquid. A pungent smell hung in the air, a mixture of sulfur and something else, something acrid and metallic. Thomas looked at Alistair, his face a mix of triumph and disappointment. They had found the lab, but the shepherd was gone. "He must have heard us coming," Alistair said, his eyes scanning the chaotic scene. "He fled." Thomas knelt down, examining the scattered vials. He recognized the symbols on the labels. They were the same symbols from the brass device. This was the shepherd's work, his twisted science laid bare. As they searched the camp, they found a journal hidden under a pile of canvas. Thomas carefully opened the book. The pages were filled with meticulous notes, sketches, and diagrams. The handwriting was neat, precise. He flipped through the pages, his blood running cold. The journal detailed the shepherd's experiments, his obsession with what he called chronological compression, the process of accelerating time within a living organism. He wrote about his early failures, his attempts on animals, and then, in a chillingly detached tone, his success with the 3 men from Mill Creek. The journal described the bitter drink, a concoction of rare plants and powerful chemicals. It described the brass device, which wasn't a catalyst but a temporal resonator, a device designed to disrupt the natural flow of time on a cellular level. It was a tool of unimaginable cruelty. But the most horrifying revelation was not the notes on the experiments, but the man's philosophy. The shepherd wrote about his belief that humanity was a disease, a slow-moving plague on the planet. He saw himself as a shepherd, a guide who would compress the lives of those he deemed unworthy to speed up the end. He was a madman, a sociopath who believed he was doing the world a favor. He was not just a scientist. He was a self-proclaimed messiah of death. They had found the truth, but they had lost their man. Thomas looked around the abandoned camp, the weight of the journal heavy in his hands. The air was still, and the only sound was the rustle of leaves. The shepherd was out there, a ghost in the machine, a man who had committed an act of unspeakable horror and was now free to do it again. Thomas felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just a search for a criminal, it was a race against a monster who believed he was an angel of mercy. He knew he had to stop him before he could find new victims. The hunt was on, and this time, Thomas would not fail. The return to Mill Creek was heavy with the weight of their discovery. The journal, a horrifying document of the shepherd's twisted ambitions, was a testament to the chilling reality of what had happened. Thomas and Alistair spent the next few days poring over the pages, trying to find a clue to the man's identity or his next move. The journal contained no name, no address, just the cold, detached observations of a deranged mind. The town, however, was in a state of uneasy peace. The mob had dispersed, their fears now replaced by a more tangible and therefore more terrifying truth. A man, not a curse, was responsible. The story of the found laboratory and the journal spread through the town like wildfire. People were still scared, but now they had a face for their terror. A man with ice-blue eyes and a penchant for sulfur. While Thomas worked with the constable and a few trusted men to organize a wider search, Alistair focused on the one person who might hold the key: Silas. The young man's condition had stabilized, but his mind remained a fractured landscape. Alistair, armed with a new understanding of the temporal resonator and the chemical concoction, knew he had to try one last time. He sat with Silas in his room, the scent of antiseptic and old wood filling the air. Clara sat beside her husband, her hand in his, her face a portrait of quiet suffering. Alistair held the brass device in his hand, its cold surface a stark contrast to the warmth of the room. "Silas," Alistair said gently, his voice soft and non-threatening, "I know this is hard, but I have to ask you something. I found this. Do you remember seeing it?" Silas looked at the device, his eyes, which had been so distant, suddenly focusing. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, followed by a spasm of fear. He recoiled from the device, his body trembling. The noise, he rasped, his voice a dry whisper. It hums, it makes the quiet loud. Alistair looked at Clara, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. He had to press on. Silas, did he do this to you? Did he use this on you? Silas shook his head, a new torrent of tears streaming down his withered face. No, it was Jeremiah. He took the drink first. He said it would make us feel powerful. The shepherd. He promised us great things. He said he would show us the future. The words hung in the air, a devastating revelation. Jeremiah, the reclusive hunter, had been in on it. But why? What did he promise you? Thomas asked, his voice low and firm. He had entered the room a few minutes earlier, silent as a ghost, and had heard the confession. Silas looked at him, a terrible clarity in his eyes. He said he could show us a world without the fever, a world where our families, they wouldn't suffer. He said he was a healer of time. Thomas's mind reeled. The fever, a disease that had ravaged the county a few years ago, claiming the lives of many, including Jeremiah's wife and Elias's youngest daughter. This was the motive. The shepherd wasn't just a sociopath. He was a manipulator, a man who preyed on the grief and desperation of others. He had promised them a way to erase the past, to rewrite history, and Jeremiah, consumed by his grief, had fallen for the lie. He had become the shepherd's accomplice. The journal had a section dedicated to the subliminal recruitment of subjects. It detailed how the shepherd would find people who were consumed by loss and promise them a way to escape their pain. He would use their grief as a tool, a weapon. Alistair asked the final question, the one that had been nagging at them all along. Silas, what happened to Jeremiah? Where is he? Silas's eyes welled up again. The shepherd. He said Jeremiah had betrayed him. He said he was a flawed vessel. He used the device on him. He aged him even more. Made him an example. He just crumbled. The silence in the room was deafening. Jeremiah hadn't just aged. The shepherd had used the device to accelerate his aging to a point of physical collapse. Jeremiah, the accomplice, had become the victim. He had been a tool, a means to an end, and the shepherd had disposed of him when he was no longer useful. Thomas walked out of the room, his face a mask of cold fury. The truth was far more sinister than he had imagined. This wasn't just about a madman, it was about a sociopath who exploited human grief for his own perverse experiments. He had used Jeremiah's suffering against him, turned him into a co-conspirator, and then destroyed him. The hunt was no longer just about finding a man. It was about avenging the victims, both the living and the dead. The shepherd had left a trail of emotional and physical devastation, and Thomas swore to himself he would follow it to the very end. He had a name now, not the shepherd, but Jeremiah's accomplice. And he had a motive. He was coming for the shepherd, and he would not rest until he had brought this monster to justice. The confession from Silas was the break Thomas had desperately needed. It gave him a new perspective, a motive, and a chilling understanding of the shepherd's methods. The man wasn't just a scientist. He was a predator who hunted the emotionally vulnerable. Thomas, with Alistair's help, began to piece together a new strategy. They would not simply search for a man. They would search for a pattern. They returned to the journal, reading every entry with a new, more discerning eye. They noticed a recurring theme: the shepherd's fascination with grief and trauma. He meticulously documented the emotional state of his victims before the procedure, noting their past hardships and personal tragedies. The chronological compression wasn't just a physical experiment, it was a psychological one, a twisted attempt to heal a man's past by accelerating his future. As they read through the entries, Alistair's eyes caught a familiar name mentioned in a postscript. It was a name he recognized from a different medical journal, a prominent but disgraced chemist from Boston. The name was Arthur Pendleton, a man who had been ostracized from the scientific community years ago for his radical and highly unethical theories on time and aging. The description matched: a quiet man with penetrating, icy blue eyes, known for his reclusive nature and a consuming passion for his work. Thomas felt a surge of triumph. They had a name. The shepherd was Arthur Pendleton, a disgraced scientist, a man with a motive and a terrifying, unshakable belief in his own righteousness. They immediately sent a message to the nearest federal marshal requesting assistance. But Thomas knew they couldn't wait. Pendleton was a man on the move, and he was likely already seeking his next victim. They needed to find him before he could strike again. Thomas went to the town's small telegraph office, a small shack near the rail yard. He sent a message to the Boston Police Department inquiring about Arthur Pendleton. The response was a confirmation of Alistair's discovery. Pendleton was indeed a known figure, a man who had vanished from the public eye after a series of controversial and dangerous experiments. The police had lost track of him years ago. With a name and a face, Thomas felt a renewed sense of purpose. He returned to the Blackwood swamp, but this time he wasn't just searching for a man. He was hunting a ghost. He and his small team of men scoured the area, looking for any sign of a new camp. They searched for footprints, for strange chemical smells, for any indication that Pendleton had returned to his laboratory. But the swamp was vast, and the trail was cold. Then, a stroke of luck. A young boy, a delivery boy for the local post office, came to Thomas with a strange story. He had seen a man matching Pendleton's description at a small, isolated farm a few miles north of town. The farm belonged to a reclusive woman named Eleanor Vance, a widow who had recently lost her only son to the same fever that had claimed Jeremiah's wife. Thomas's heart sank. Eleanor Vance, a woman consumed by grief, a perfect victim for the shepherd. He knew he had to act fast. He gathered his team, and they rode out to the farm, their horses' hooves thundering on the dusty road. They arrived at the Vance farm as the sun was setting, casting long, menacing shadows across the fields. The farm was quiet, unnervingly so. The front door was ajar, a small black carriage parked in the driveway. The shepherd's carriage. He was here. They moved in, their boots silent on the porch. Thomas pushed the door open and stepped inside, his gun raised. The air was thick with the same acrid metallic smell from the laboratory. He heard voices from the sitting room, low and hushed. He approached the doorway cautiously, his men fanned out behind him. He peered into the room. Eleanor Vance sat in her armchair, her face pale, a small, half-empty cup on the table beside her. Standing opposite her, his back to Thomas, was a man with a precise, almost clinical posture. He held a small glass vial in his hand, a strange, dark liquid swirling within. It was Arthur Pendleton. "The past is a heavy burden, Eleanor," Pendleton said, his voice calm and melodic. "But I can lift it. I can make it as if your son, as if he never suffered. I can give you a new beginning." Eleanor looked at the vial, her eyes wide with a desperate hope. You can do that?" "I can," Pendleton said, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "I am the shepherd, and I can guide you to a world without sorrow." Thomas kicked the door open, his voice a roar. "Arthur Pendleton, put the vial down. It's over." Pendleton turned, his face a mask of shock, then a cold, venomous fury. His ice-blue eyes fixed on Thomas, and for a fleeting moment Thomas saw not just a man, but a monster. He dropped the vial, and it shattered on the floor, the dark liquid seeping into the wooden planks. Pendleton made a run for the back door, but Thomas was too fast. He lunged forward, tackling the man to the ground. A brief, violent struggle ensued. Pendleton was surprisingly strong, fueled by a madman's desperation. He fought with a feral intensity, scratching and biting, but Thomas and his men were too many. They subdued him, pinning him to the ground, his wrists cuffed behind his back. He lay there, his body racked with rage, his eyes still fixed on Thomas. He had been so close to claiming another victim, to proving his twisted theories. Thomas stood over him, his heart pounding in his chest. The hunt was over. The shepherd was captured. But the victory felt hollow. He looked at Eleanor Vance, who sat in her chair, a living testament to the evil that had almost claimed her. He had saved her, but he couldn't erase her grief. He had stopped the monster, but he couldn't undo the damage he had done. He looked at Pendleton, his face a mask of bitter defeat. "It's over, Pendleton," he said, his voice hard. "You're done." Pendleton didn't reply. He just stared at Thomas, a single chilling phrase leaving his lips. "You can't stop the quiet, Sheriff. It's already here." Thomas didn't understand the words, but he felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach. The case was solved, but he had a terrible feeling that the horror was just beginning. Please consider subscribing to the channel to catch the final, thrilling chapters of this story. Your support helps us create more content like this. The air in the Mill Creek jail was thick with the scent of old iron and stale tobacco. Arthur Pendleton sat in the cell, his face a mask of placid indifference. Thomas Finch, seated opposite him, felt a simmering rage beneath his calm exterior. He had a man who had ruined lives, a man who had stolen time, and he had to make him talk. "Why, Pendleton?" Thomas asked, his voice low. "Why did you do it? To what end?" Pendleton smiled, a cold, humorless expression that sent a shiver down Thomas's spine. "You don't understand, Sheriff. You see the surface, the aging, the withering, but you don't see the truth. I was offering them a release, an escape from the slow, agonizing decay of grief." "You were experimenting on human beings," Thomas retorted, his voice rising. "You used their pain as a tool. Pain is a catalyst," Pendleton said, leaning forward. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were piercing. "It makes them receptive. My temporal compression is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of mercy. I speed up the process of life to bring them to their final, peaceful conclusion more quickly." Thomas shook his head, a mixture of disgust and disbelief on his face. "You call that mercy? Look at what you did to those men. You left them as shells. And what about Jeremiah? You killed him." Pendleton's smile faded. "Jeremiah was a flawed vessel. He wanted to use my science for his own selfish ends. He wanted to rewrite his own past. My work is not for the past. It is for the future. I am accelerating the end to bring about a new beginning." Thomas felt his blood run cold. This man wasn't just a sociopath. He was a full-blown fanatic. He believed his grotesque science was a righteous crusade. "You said something to me when I caught you," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You said, 'You can't stop the quiet, Sheriff. It's already here.' What did you mean by that?" Pendleton's smile returned wider this time, filled with a malicious glee. "You found my camp, Sheriff. You found my journal. But you didn't find everything. My work. It's in the water. The Blackwood Swamp is my greatest experiment. I am cultivating silence. The ultimate peace." Thomas's mind reeled. The water, the chemical smell that had clung to the air in the swamp, the bitter drink the men had been given. He hadn't just poisoned them. He had poisoned the land itself. He stood up, his hand gripping the cell bars. "What did you do, Pendleton?" "I infused the water," Pendleton said, his voice a low, triumphant purr. "A diluted dose. It is a slow, methodical process. A silent killer. It will seep into the earth, into the plants, into the very air you breathe. It will make the quiet loud, and then it will make it silent." Thomas ran from the jail, his mind in a state of frantic panic. He found Alistair in his office, poring over the journal again. "Alistair," Thomas said, his voice breathless. "He didn't just poison them. He poisoned the swamp. He put something in the water. He's been doing it for months." Alistair looked up, his face pale. "Uncle, that's impossible. The water would have changed color. The animals would have died." "He said it was a diluted dose," Thomas explained, pacing back and forth. "A slow, methodical process. Something that wouldn't be noticeable at first. Something that would spread slowly, imperceptibly." Alistair grabbed the journal, flipping through the pages. "He wrote about it," he said, his voice trembling. He called it the Great Compression, a way to introduce his temporal agent into the ecosystem, to accelerate the aging of all life, to bring about a silent, natural conclusion. The horror of the situation was almost too much to bear. This wasn't just about 3 men. It was about an entire ecosystem, an entire town. The water supply of Mill Creek was fed by a creek that flowed directly from the Blackwood Swamp. For months, Pendleton had been methodically poisoning the water, preparing for his ultimate experiment. Thomas looked out the window, his gaze fixed on the town. The people going about their daily lives, oblivious to the silent poison seeping into their bodies. The children playing in the street, the farmers tending to their crops, the women washing their clothes in the creek. All of them, unknowingly, were a part of Pendleton's mad experiment. He felt a profound sense of helplessness. He had captured the man, but the real horror was already at work. The damage was done. The shepherd had won. His chilling prophecy was coming true. The quiet was here, and it would soon turn to a deadly silence. Panic spread through Mill Creek faster than a fire in a dry field. The news of Pendleton's confession and the poisoned water supply sent the town into a frenzy. People rushed to the creek, their faces contorted with fear, staring at the water as if it were a living serpent. The town doctor, Alistair, had tested the water samples, and to his horror, he found traces of a complex chemical compound, the very one Pendleton had detailed in his journal. It was a slow-acting poison, a subtle agent that would not kill but would accelerate the aging process on a cellular level. Thomas, now a man on a mission, felt the weight of the town's fate on his shoulders. He had to act, and he had to act fast. He gathered the townspeople, his voice cutting through the hysteria. "We must find a way to stop it," he said. "We have to neutralize the agent. Alistair, what do we need?" Alistair, his face pale but his eyes resolute, had been poring over the journal. "He wrote about it," he said, his voice strained. "He developed a counter-agent, an antidote. He called it the reversal. It's a complex formula, a mixture of natural acids and a specific type of limestone found in the caves near the old Mill Creek mine." The information was a lifeline, a glimmer of hope in the suffocating darkness. Thomas immediately organized a search party, a group of men and women who were brave enough to face the unknown. Their mission: find the limestone in the caves and bring it back to Alistair. The journey to the old mine was a perilous one. The caves were known for their treacherous paths and a history of collapses. But the townspeople, united by a common fear and a common purpose, did not hesitate. They were no longer victims. They were fighters. As Thomas led the group, a deep sense of guilt gnawed at him. He had been so focused on finding the man that he had missed the bigger picture. He had been so sure that the horror was contained that he had failed to see the silent, insidious threat lurking in the very water they drank. He had been so close and yet so far from the truth. Meanwhile, back in the town, Alistair worked tirelessly in his makeshift laboratory. He had taken a sample of the poisoned water and was working on a way to create the antidote. But the formula in the journal was complex, filled with cryptic symbols and incomplete diagrams. He needed more. He needed to talk to Pendleton. He went to the jail, his face grim. Pendleton sat in his cell, a smug, infuriating smile on his face. "Come to beg for the cure, doctor," he sneered. "You can't stop it. The Great Compression is already in motion." "I can stop it," Alistair said, his voice firm. "But I need your help. Tell me how to complete the formula." Pendleton's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating gaze. "Why would I? My work is my legacy. I won't let you undo it." Alistair knew he had to appeal to the man's ego. "Your work is incomplete, Pendleton," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "The temporal agent is unstable. It will not just accelerate life, it will unravel it. It will cause a complete collapse. It will be chaos, not the quiet you seek. Your legacy will be one of destruction, not salvation." Pendleton's eyes widened, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. His arrogance was his greatest weakness. He had to be a messiah, not a destroyer. The thought of his work being flawed, of it leading to a chaotic end instead of a peaceful one, was a blow to his ego he could not bear. The limestone. It's a catalyst, Pendleton said, his voice a low hiss. A precise amount is needed. Too much, and it accelerates the collapse. Too little, and it's useless. He began to draw a diagram on the dirt floor of his cell, a series of symbols and numbers, a final, twisted gift to his unwitting apprentice. Alistair feverishly copied the diagram into his notebook, his hands trembling. He had it, the final piece of the puzzle. He ran from the jail, his heart pounding in his chest. He met Thomas and the search party as they returned from the mine, their hands full of the precious white limestone. Alistair quickly explained the new information, and they immediately set to work. The race against time was on. They had to create the antidote and introduce it into the water supply before the poison could take hold. They worked through the night, a small army of determined men and women, grinding the limestone, mixing it with acids, and creating the reversal agent. As the sun began to rise, a new fear settled in. They had the antidote, but they had to get it to the Blackwood Swamp, the source of the poison. They had to pour it into the headwaters to neutralize the agent at its source. Thomas looked at the townspeople, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and hope. He knew this was their only chance. He would lead them to the swamp, and they would defeat the shepherd's last, most terrifying legacy. The quiet was here, but they would not let it become a silence. They would fight, and they would win. The final journey to Blackwood Swamp was not one of fear, but of grim determination. Thomas Finch, leading the procession of townspeople, carried the heavy wooden barrels containing the antidote. The air, once so oppressive with humidity and dread, now felt charged with a new energy, hope. They had the solution, and they would not fail. They reached the headwaters of the swamp, the source of Mill Creek. The water was still and dark, a mirror reflecting the twisted, gnarled trees. The air, as always, was thick with the scent of decay, but now, mixed with it, was the acrid tang of the chemical agent. "Now," Thomas commanded, "pour the antidote into the water, every last drop." Men and women, working in unison, lifted the heavy barrels and poured the white, milky substance into the dark water. The liquid spread, swirling and mixing, a visible sign of their defiance. A hiss, like a dying snake, rose from the water as the chemicals reacted, neutralizing the temporal agent. The smell of decay was replaced by the clean, earthy scent of rain on a forest floor. The process was slow, but they watched as the milky substance spread, inch by inch, slowly consuming the poison. The swamp, the very symbol of their terror, was being cleansed. The silence, which had been so heavy with foreboding, now felt like a promise of peace. As they worked, a single figure emerged from the tree line. It was Alistair, his face pale and grim. "Uncle Thomas," he said, his voice low. "Pendleton, he's gone." Thomas's heart sank. "Gone? How?" "He told me where the real reversal was," Alistair explained, his voice trembling. "The antidote was a feint. The real one was in his cell, a hidden vial of a more concentrated agent. He said he was going to accelerate his own path. He drank it." A cold knot of dread formed in Thomas's stomach. Pendleton hadn't been defeated. He had taken his final, most twisted act of control. He had become his own final experiment. Thomas ran back to the town, his mind racing. He burst into the jail cell. It was empty. The cell door was still locked, but Pendleton was gone. He looked down at the floor, and there in a corner was a small, withered husk, a body that had been aged to a horrifying extreme, a final, macabre testament to the man's own mad science. Pendleton had not escaped. He had chosen his own end, a final act of horrifying ego. He had proved his theory at the cost of his own life. Thomas felt no triumph, only a profound, suffocating sorrow. The case was closed. The shepherd was gone. But his legacy, a living, breathing horror, remained. He returned to the swamp, his face grim. The antidote had done its work. The water was safe. The town was saved. The people cheered, their faces a mix of relief and exhaustion. They had faced a monster and won. But for Thomas, the victory felt hollow. He looked at the swamp, the quiet woods that had been the stage for so much human suffering. He thought of the three men, their lives stolen, their minds broken. He thought of Jeremiah, a man consumed by grief who had become a victim of his own desperation. And he thought of Pendleton, a brilliant mind twisted by a horrific ideology who had chosen to become the very thing he had created. The case of the hunting party was over. The town would slowly heal, but the scars would remain. The memory of what had happened would live on. A cautionary tale whispered around bonfires. A story not of ghosts or magic, but of a different, more chilling kind of horror. The kind that is born in the quiet, dark corners of the human heart. The kind that can be found not in the supernatural, but in the terrifying reality of what one man can do to another. The quiet was gone, but the sound of its silence would echo in their hearts forever.